Welcome to Relevant History. I am Fabian Lopez, and today we're going back to the basics. If you're here because A, want to better understand history, B, want to feel more confident learning about history, or C, all the above, well, I got good news for you. First, we're not going over an overwhelming amount of historical information, or at least information that you should definitely commit to memory. Second, this video series will go over historiography, or what historians do to study history. And believe me, the easiest way to learn history is to understand what history is. So let's get started. What do we mean when we say history? Is it just another word for the past, important events, old records? Before we get into all that, let me give you a simple definition that we will build upon throughout this series. History is simply the interpretation of the past.
I get it! I don't get it.
Okay, so that definition just leaves more questions than answers about history. Mainly, it leaves these 4 questions. For now, we're going to focus on the first and main one, but I'm going to change the question a little bit. What makes up good history? Put simply, history started when humans realized they had memories worth storing and passing on. Most of these were stored in different ways, such as writing, religious tradition, and oral traditions. Are these really examples of histories though? Not really. You see, the memory is faulty, and also there tends to be a lot of addition of myths within these sources. So although they're not good examples of what history really is, they're definitely good examples of what memory is. Think about it kind of like when your grandpa or good old uncle comes and tells you those stories of
back in my day.
They're certainly telling you real past events, but they alone are not history. So what distinguishes a memory being told as a story from history? The two words are obviously related, and history is effectively told as a story. Well, the difference lies between 1, how the story is told, or the narrative, and 2, the meaning behind preserving memory in history. Let's start with narrative. In Western culture, the change of narrative is said to have started with none other than the Greek historian Herodotus, aka the father of history. Apart from appearing in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Herodotus wrote the Histories, which, via point to the original meaning behind the word history, or historiai. In ancient Greek, this translates to learning or knowing by inquiry. Herodotus inquired or investigated specific information and put it together. Most of this narrative was about the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, but he also focused a lot on the cultures, myths, religions, and customs of many different societies outside of Greece. What can I say? That was also a traveler. He basically left us a travel blog. But being the first to try this form of narrative, Herodotus made plenty of mistakes. His techniques used to collect information are pretty primitive by today's standards, and by that I mean that he depended on his travels, local hearsay, and of course oral traditions. If you remember what I said about memory and myth, then it comes to no surprise that Herodotus ended up creating some really weird stories. For example, there's a giant golden ants in Persia that ate camels. Or what about the drug-smoking Scythians? I mean, now some modern historians even call him father of lies. But if you discredit Herodotus, then who is the real father of, it's Thucydides? Thucydides, another Greek historian who lived around the same time as Herodotus. He's best known for writing the history of the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between Athens and Sparta. There's always been a big argument on which of the two was the real father of history, but I'll save you the trouble of that argument. Instead, for now let's agree that Thucydides has the title of the father of scientific history. Why? Because his methods also contributed a lot to the historian's way of studying. Unlike Herodotus, Thucydides was very critical of the information he got. He also focused more on politics and war, rather than focusing on different cultures, and he preferred talking about recently past events, not as remote as Herodotus. He also liked to look for patterns of cause and effect to try to explain the war between Athens and Sparta. It's worth mentioning that after Herodotus and Thucydides came a long line of Greek and Roman historians who added more to both sides of narrative, including storytelling. This explains the change from historiae in Greek to historia in Latin. So the changes in narrative is the reason why the Greeks are considered the fathers of history, at least in Western culture. But what about the part that has to do with the meaning behind preserving memory? Well, the Greeks, surprisingly, are actually not as good on that as you may think. For example, Herodotus wrote that the purpose behind writing his histories was for, and I quote, in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and that great and marvelous deeds not lose their glory. Thucydides is also vague in the meaning behind writing about the Peloponnesian War. He writes that his history is for, and I quote, those who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to understanding the future. With the Greeks not finding a greater meaning behind history other than to remember great events in the future, Columbia University professor Yosef Hayim Yerushalmi argues that Jewish memory and religious rites has allowed the Jews to come up with a meaningful view of history, in which the Jewish community tries to bring their past and bring it into their present lives. Hey, that's actually what I'm trying to do here. Western culture ended up adopting this Jewish idea of bringing history into the present, especially during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I already talked a lot about the origins of history in ancient times, so I won't go too much into detail. Just remember that during the Middle Ages, this idea of history for the present was there, but instead it had to shift the focus into the Catholic Church through the use of chronologies. During the Renaissance, the same idea was there, but again, the change of focus went from the church into the lives of famous individuals, especially with the use of biographies. Sounds familiar? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Alright, I'm gonna spend the last half of this video talking about what modern historians have added to historiography. I will mostly be focusing on the debates that arose regarding three topics: facts, objectivity, and causation. To make things simple, I'm going to use as a guide this classic book in historiography, E.H. Carr's What is History? I'm also going to split the modern historians into two groups based on their time periods. So let's meet them. Okay, so in the red corner, we got a bunch of historians from the 18th and 19th centuries. For this video, let's call these the classical historians. And in the blue corner, you got more historians, but these come from the 20th and 21st century. In this video, let's call these the contemporary historians. So classical historians like Yilmish Leopold von Ranke and others are known for professionalizing the way facts were collected. By this, I just mean they went to their national archives and collected facts to write nationalistic histories. Not all these histories were about countries, though. Women historians like Bonnie Smith and Hannah Adams often focused on religion, society, culture, and the roles that women played on them. So here, contemporary historians like E.H. Carr have no problem with the idea of fact collecting, but he disproves on how the historians see facts themselves. You see, classical historians like G.H.F. Hegel believed an absolute truth to history existed. All it takes is to collect as many facts as possible and let the quote-unquote guiding spirit of history reveal the truth. This idea of fact collecting went well with the philosophy of positivism, which says we can only and only prove knowledge by using our senses to detect natural laws through science. This bothered Carr because positivism's strict sense-only approach basically means historians cannot add anything to the sources and instead quote-unquote dissolve or immerse oneself so that only things, also known as facts, themselves would talk. All in the hopes to write a history as it really was. I'm sure anyone who's had a history class where all you do is remember facts agrees with Carr on how boring this can be. In 1492, what is Carr's alternative to positivism? Well, it's empiricism, which states that the origin of all knowledge comes from our physical experiences, and also science. Now, if you think about it, history is all about human experience, and it also retains this idea kind of like a science in trying to find the truth. Now, that sounds better, until you ask yourself, when do we know when we find the truth? As you can tell, contemporary historians opposing the positivism of classical historians also ended up opposing the idea of an absolute or objective truth. This only led to another huge debate between contemporary historians themselves, which I'll summarize for you. Can history be truly objective? Some say no and argue for the idea of presentism, that we must focus on describing history using our own present ideas. E.H. Carr and UCLA professor Carlo Ginzburg really opposed this because it soon began to push for the relativism of facts themselves. Ginzburg even wrote a book writing how it's okay for historians to use their own perspective, but without destroying the objective idea of facts. Why did he do this? Because Carlo Ginzburg saw how dangerous relativism could be if it fell in the hands of someone who, for example, was trying to deny that the Nazis killed millions of Jews during the Holocaust. And this was a personal example for Ginzburg, because he lost his father during the Holocaust. So now what did E.H. Carr do to combine the objective facts using empiricism with the personal perspective without becoming too over-relativistic? Well, he introduced the idea of selectivity, or selecting facts based on their historical usefulness. Selectivity is useful for historians because it allows them to choose the facts that they need without going into relativistic territory and saying that all fact-based arguments are equally valid. That's how, if you're given these two statements with historical facts, you're still able to tell which one's real and which one's fake. It's a nice compromise, but now the question is, what determines whether a fact is historically useful or not? That, my friends, would be interpretation, one of the most fundamental aspects of history. Interpretation simply means explain, but the key here is the inter part, which, check this out, is Latin for between or mediate. So what Carr is saying is that the best way to approach history and still be able to retain some objectivity is to be able to mediate between facts and our own viewpoint. Carr's book has been widely challenged, but personally this has been one of the best descriptions that I've seen between the tensions of the objective and subjective in history, so let's keep it that way. Now let's look at the final debate among historians regarding cause and effect. This is such a big part of historiography that even ancient histories have it. If you look at examples of myths, you often see this causality as involving the gods. Herodotus also explored causation in his histories, mainly on focusing on what were the causes behind the Greco-Persian wars. Even Thucydides looked for the causes behind the war between Sparta and Athens in his work. E.H. Carr also wrote of it, and he usually called it determinism. When you look at causations used in history, it's often treated in three ways. First, you have cyclical history, which essentially looks at history as a cycle that tends to be good at spotting patterns. The only problem with that is that it's not really good at explaining why there's a repeated behavior or trend in history, whether it's good or bad. The second view of history is linear history, which likes to focus on ever-changing state of things. This means it's obviously good at looking at change over time, but it can easily make historians fall into a false sense of never-stopping progress. The best example is Whiggism, an old school of history which thought that humans were eventually getting smarter and more enlightened. All you have to do is look at a conspiracy theorist and see that that is definitely not the case. The third view on causality is a mix of both linear and cyclical history. E.H. Carr's views on determinism fell on this category, but the most famous example of a mixed history would be none other than the historian Karl Marx. Yes, apart from being considered the father of communism, Karl Marx was also a historian. In his book, Das Kapital, he applies cyclical history to his theories of communism to argue that a class struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed happened throughout history for control over the means of production. But Marx also believed that there was a linear history going on at the same time, in which the oppressors were slowly being taken over by the oppressed. That's why in the Communist Manifesto, he argues that capitalism will eventually be overthrown to bring about the establishment of socialism, which will slowly evolve into what will become the destiny of human society. Communism! Okay, let's recap on what we talked about in this video to create an answer for the original question. What is history? First, we talked about the transition from memory to history under the Greeks and the Jews because of the changes in narrative and meaning. Next, we looked at E.H. Carr's What is History? And we talked about the big debates between the classical historians and the contemporary historians on facts, objectivity, and causation, while paying a special attention to Carr's ideas on selectivity and interpretation. Put all that together, and your answer to the million-dollar question is: history is the historian's interpretation of selected past events or facts which are told in a way that is relevant to us. Now that's a proper answer. If you want to further dive into the who, how, and why of history, I recommend you watch the rest of the series. That's all from me for now. I hope you learned and you also enjoyed. See you in the next video.